All rights reserved with Yolanda Taylor on Choice.
Good morning. Grab your coffee because today we're not just talking about civil rights, we're talking about power, backlash, and the truth that freedom is still under construction. My name is Yolanda Taylor, the community lawyer, and you're listening to All Rights Reserved. I want to let you guys know that I have an amazing guest with me today, this morning. Today's guest is Professor H. Timothy Lovelace Jr. He's a nationally recognized legal historian of the civil rights movement and a professor at Duke Law School. His work explores how the American civil rights movement didn't just change this country, it helped shape international human rights law as well. He also teaches constitutional law, race in the law, and civil rights history, and his scholarship has appeared in leading journals such as the Journal of American History, the California Law Review, the UCLA Law Review, Duke Law Journal, and he also has a forthcoming book that he's working on, and the title is The World is on Our Side. It examines how U.S. civil rights politics again has influenced global anti-racism efforts. The bottom line is he helps us understand civil rights is not just history, it's a global and ongoing fight. So welcome, Professor Lovelace. Thank you for being on the show this morning.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Attorney Taylor.
So, we have a lot to unpack for listeners today. And listeners, as you know, we don't just talk about these complicated, sophisticated topics. We break it down so that everyday people can leave equipped and understand, what's at stake in our communities and what's at stake in our country. So let's start with that. As it relates to civil rights, Professor Lovelace, what would you say is at stake for all of us?
Our everyday lives are at stake, and in ways in which we may not appreciate. We've had a series of U.S. Supreme Court decisions that have gutted civil rights legislation and landmark civil rights statutes. The U.S. Supreme Court has gutted affirmative action, which gave many people access to higher education and to the workplace in new ways. And then we have, a federal government that is willing to pass laws that will set us back for generations. We also are facing gerrymandering on the state level and on the federal level. And all of this while, people are just struggling financially. When I stop to get gas, right? Gas is now more than ever.
It's crazy, isn't it?
It is. And so there's a lot at stake. There's a lot at stake.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I think it was $4.05 the other morning when I stopped, and a friend posted on my social media page that she got gas for $4.99, almost $5 somewhere.
Absolutely. So lots at stake here.
A friend of mine that has a small car, she said it costs her $70 to fill up. So no telling what a big truck will cost. But you're right, a lot is at stake here. And because you are a subject matter expert as it relates to civil rights, in America, but how it has impacted the global landscape, the war in Iran as well. Of course, that's one of the things that's leading to the higher gas prices, but we were already battling inflation, and, President Trump has threatened Jerome Powell, who's over the Federal Reserve, he's the Federal Reserve chair, to lower interest rates. And it seems as if he's still pushing back a little on that. But to your point, this is just, listeners, we're just painting the landscape that we're already, dealing with so many issues that seem to be out of our control. But, to Professor Lovelace's point here, that's at stake. But let's connect that to, this current attack that most people have realized just because of going on TikTok, right? I've had friends just send me TikToks. I don't know if your friends do this to you, Professor Lovelace, and they want you to be able to explain, what has happened here? Do you see this girl? And they're talking about, what recently happened at the U.S. Supreme Court in the case Louisiana versus Calle, how it appears as if our court It's assuming that we live in a colorblind society. What are your thoughts around that?
So we are very far from a colorblind society. And so what happened in Louisiana v. Calle is that Louisiana is about 1/3 Black, but Louisiana only had one majority Black congressional district. And so a federal court had declared that the legislative map violated the Voting Rights Act of 1965. A little bit about the Voting Rights Act of 1965. It was passed in response to massive demonstrations by civil rights activists in places like Selma, Alabama, right? So Bloody Sunday, John Lewis, and many more were beaten on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. Dr. King and others are leading a charge of voting rights campaign there. And Congress sees what's going on in the South, and in particular in Selma. And President Johnson proposes new civil rights legislation as it related to voting rights. And Congress passed this in 1965. The U.S. Supreme Court then upheld the constitutionality of the Voting Rights Act shortly thereafter. It was amended a number of times, but what we get here in the most recent case in Louisiana is that a federal court had declared that Louisiana, to comply with the Voting Rights Act, needed to have not simply one majority Black district, but two majority Black districts. Mm-hmm. The U.S. Supreme Court, however, struck down this provision in the Voting Rights Act, so it was targeted at Section 2, and said that the Voting Rights Act did not require states to create majority Black districts, that to prove discrimination, that discrimination needed to be shown to be intentional and not have discriminatory results. And so the big takeaway here is that for the U.S. Supreme Court, using race to address racism was deemed to be unconstitutional.
Can you believe that? So, and there was a quote too. I raised this on my previous episode about Justice Roberts, and I know we're going to get into the whole like jurisprudence of Chief Justice Roberts, and and his role in all of this. He's leading the court, guys, the Chief Justice, of any court, especially the U.S. Supreme Court, has a significant and impactful role, right? History shows, legal scholars, like Professor Lovelace and myself. I'm somewhat of a legal scholar. I'm a lawyer, so I have to know it, in law school, and we all have to take constitutional law. We were able to sit in law school and just really look at how the court already knows where it want to go. Like they already know what the outcome is, like the majority does, and how they use reasoning, how and to get there. So let's go deep into this. My understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, is that, the 14th Amendment, that the court is determining that the Constitution, 14th Amendment, means that, we're supposed to look at these things in a colorblind way. But if we do that, then aren't we forgetting about history? Aren't we forgetting about what has happened in this country, that there has been historic racial discrimination, not against white people, but against Black people when it comes to voting and other matters? Absolutely,
right? So we get the Reconstruction amendments in the period right after the Civil War. So the Civil War ends in 1865. We get the 13th Amendment, which, among other things, abolished slavery. The 14th Amendment, which provided for equal protection under the laws, due process under law, and birthright citizenship. And then the 15th Amendment gave African-American men the right to vote. So this is 1865 for the 13th Amendment, 1868 for the 14th Amendment, and 1870 for the 15th Amendment. During this period of time of Reconstruction, this was a vibrant time in Black life. During Reconstruction, a Freedmen's Bureau was created. In the War Department, the federal government established a bureau for the freedmen, for newly emancipated African Americans. And the Freedmen's Bureau gave, among other things, housing, clothing, food, education, medical services, legal services, and much more, right, to newly emancipated African Americans as part of the effort to rebuild America after the Civil War. And so historically Black colleges and universities like Howard University received funds from the federal government to be established. Hampton, Fisk, and other institutions were created during this period of time. And so what you see, there was a bank that was only for African Americans that was created by the federal government, right? What you see is during this period of time, during Reconstruction, color consciousness was the way. That color consciousness was deemed to be the path to making America more egalitarian, to level the playing field. If we're being faithful to the history of Reconstruction, this period of time where HBCUs are being created, where there are new Black legislators in the state of South Carolina, for example, you had people who had been recently emancipated who become legislators. And in fact, there's a term in South Carolina where the lower house had a Black majority. We can't even imagine that right now. The state of Mississippi had 2 Black U.S. senators. U.S. senators. We can't even imagine that now, right? There was not another Black U.S. senator until Edward Brooke, and this is well into the 20th century. And then there wasn't another until Carol Moseley Braun and then Barack Obama. Louisiana had a Black governor for a very short period of time in the 1870s. There was not another Black governor in America until Doug Wilder in Virginia. And this is right around 1990. And so all of this to say, Reconstruction was a period where race consciousness, not race blindness, was the law of the land, where the 14th Amendment had great promise. What conservatives have done today is to use these provisions designed for African Americans, for the freedmen, and they've turned it on its head. And they've said that, right, equal protection means that there cannot be the types of programs that were created in the 1860s or 1870s. Those types of programs are unconstitutional. This raises a hard question. Did those who framed the 14th Amendment, were they creating laws that were unconstitutional? Absolutely not. They were creating programs that, like the Freedmen's Bureau, that were color conscious to help Black people. And so if one thinks that having affirmative action today violates the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, go back and study the history of the Freedmen's Bureau, right? We don't get HBCUs out of nowhere. That race conscious measures are constitutional if we're looking at the history of Reconstruction.
And to your point, and listeners, I just want to emphasize like what Professor Lovelace has just stated. It created real like legal freedom, not just symbolic freedom, right? After enslaved African people were quote unquote emancipated. We know it didn't happen quickly in some places. That's why we have Juneteenth as well. But it wasn't just symbolic freedom, right? It was real legal freedom. Because like you said, the 13th Amendment ended slavery. The 14th Amendment made Black people citizens. The 15th Amendment gave Black men the right to vote. So Black people went from property to citizens to voters. So all this is connected. This is the backdrop. History is important. It's important that we understand history so we need not repeat it, right? But we see a concerted effort to pull us back. So why do you think Justice Chief Roberts and the majority on the court, why do you think they're trying to turn a page on civil rights? Do they really think that racism doesn't exist anymore? Or is this for political power?
I think it's the latter, political power. I think that they are using constitutional law to advance constitutional politics, that they have very clear ideas about what race relations in America should look like. And so they start their opinions with an outcome in mind. And then they reverse engineer, right, law to fit those ends. And what's so interesting is that Chief Justice Roberts and certainly justices like Clarence Thomas are often using historical methods to arrive at their ends. So Thomas and others call themselves originalists. And what an originalist is someone who wants to go back to the period in which a constitutional amendment was adopted and understand how law was understood at that time. So here in the context of the 14th Amendment, they want to go back to 1868 to understand how law was in 1868 and interpret law in 2026 like people did more than a century and a half ago. Now, that should raise all kinds of red flags to us, right? We don't want to go back. We want to go forward, right? We don't want to go back to these old days. If you go back to 1791 and you think about, right, the original Constitution, we certainly don't want to go back to those days where slaveholders are interpreting the Constitution, where they're developing the Constitution and interpreting the Constitution. But if you want to play that game, and let's just stay within this logic, that's troubling. But if you want to play that game, then for the originalists, the conservatives on the U.S. Supreme Court, if they want to go back to history, then take a look at the Freedmen's Bureau. Take a look at all of the race-conscious measures that were being used to help newly emancipated African Americans to decide these cases. As I mentioned, there was a Freedmen's Bank that was created in 1865. The bank falls apart for any number of reasons, part of which is that the federal government did not provide it with enough support. But imagine today, we can't even imagine today a bank that's only for Black people. They had that in 1868. And so if that is your benchmark, if that's your starting point, then any of the race-conscious measures that people use today, where race is often used as one of many factors, or Black people amongst other people of color might benefit, but there might be many other racial groups that might benefit from a DEI initiative, for example. That seems,
white women
pales in comparison. It pales in comparison. Exactly.
Like
right?
white women benefited mostly from DEI, than, Black people in general or any other group. So to your point, yeah, that whole DEI, that part was to enforce certain civil rights, right? Like you could have like anti-discrimination laws as it relates to discrimination in the work environment. But in order to enforce some of those things, you needed like the teeth to be added to the law. You needed the criteria and the guidance to be added to the law. Like, what does discrimination look like? So, diversity, equity, and inclusion was, to me, when I think about it, it's just the mechanism to enforce the law. It's about, when you're hiring, you can't really assume that all the white people there are the only qualified pool of talent that's out there. But there is a sentiment that we see it on social media. There's a sentiment, even if we believe like Chief Justice Roberts or maybe these justices on the Supreme Court or on some of the federal court that are conservative in nature, even if we believe that they're using this for constitutional power gain or political power gain, there are real people and MAGAs, people who voted for Trump, who really believe, or they pretend to believe, if they don't genuinely believe this, that racism doesn't exist and that we're the ones, the Democrat Party or Black people, who clap back on social media, that we're the ones still fanning, racism and division in this country. We've seen these comments, right? So what do we say, like, if there's just so happen, conservative person listening to this radio show, and I'm not saying I have any conservative listeners, but I'm sure I do have some conservative people, who are friends of mine on social media. How do you even help them understand? I mean, because I think this is a point, we're at the crossroads in our history where everyone needs to be aware that, do we want civil rights to be dismantled? Because like you said, it may come to us first, but then it can come towards white women. White women can eventually be impacted by this, and I feel like, others as well can be impacted. So I know I said a lot there, but I guess my point was, when you see the discussions on social media And some folks saying, well, we want to hire qualified people. That's why there shouldn't be DEI. DEI is not hiring qualified people or people who feel as if we're the ones fanning division because we talk about race too much. So why does race still matter? I guess that's a better way to summarize all that that I just said. Why does race still matter?
Race structures literally every part of American life. And race structures where people are born, what hospital they're born in, right? When that baby, before the baby actually was even born, the maternal health, we know that Black women have received disparate treatment at hospitals compared to white women. When that baby goes home, where does that baby live? We still live often in very segregated patterns by race and by class. Where a child goes to school, right? That's often tied to race, that public schools are in particular resegregating by race. When that child travels in a car, the likelihood of being stopped when you're African American compared to being white, right? The stops are more frequent for African Americans. When that child applies to college, when that child has a job and becomes an adult, right? We know that there's an income gap and a wealth gap within between white and African American people. So at every turn, race, there's a disparate impact as it relates to Black life compared to white life in America. And so if we think that all people are equal, if we think that Black people are equal to white people, then you would not have you would not have disparate impacts at every turn. This is not an accident. This is about structural racism.
It is. And you know what? And it's hard for people to understand structural racism, right? They feel, and we can go back and look, and people are now sharing like black and white footages of some woman named Barbara fussing and fighting about, we don't want Negroes in our schools, right? And I'm like, fast forward, we have Moms for Liberty. They're not saying we don't want Negroes in our school, but what they are saying is you shouldn't be teaching Black history. You shouldn't be teaching, before they called it the woke agenda or DEI, they were coming after critical race theory. I'm on the board of a charter school, and I want to say, like, during the pandemic, we were on Zoom, and every time we would have a board meeting, there would be some parent from Moms for Liberty up there asking, are you teaching critical race theory? Like every,
But ask them to define critical race theory.
Exactly.
Ask them to define critical race theory.
And I was like, at the K through 12 level, no, but I am, because I used to be an adjunct professor of law at Wake Forest Law School, and I was teaching critical race theory unapologetically. Probably this is why I'm not there now, but I was teaching critical race theory unapologetically. But yeah, she didn't know what it was. All they think is, as we can look at the bills that their elected champions, not ours, passed around DEI, the DEI tax, it would say things like anything that makes one race feel guilty. What is that? How are you feeling guilty? Because now all of American history is being taught. You weren't there. You didn't do it. It wasn't you. Like, it wasn't me that was like, wrongfully enslaved. So I don't know why you're feeling guilty. The facts are the facts, ma'am. So, so I think they were defining it as anything that makes one race feel guilty, anything that sows division, and then the bill is just so crazy, because even as a person on the board of a school, when we had to realize that we had to implement the Parent Bill of Rights that did pass, I'm just like, parents already have rights. This is nothing new here. I have the right to say, I don't want my child reading that book, and there have been books I thought were not age appropriate for my daughter. And I've exercised that right as a parent. But to your point, they couldn't define critical race theory, but they were asking. And I think critical race theory was the precursor to the whole anti-DEI movement, because I remember it clear as day. That was the talking point, and that's what they were looking for.
Yeah, so absolutely. So critical race theory, the attacks on critical race theory were successful in many parts of the country, and um, those, victories, if you call them victories, were no doubt rolled into a broader attack on DEI, which is so interesting to kind of think about because there are many people who are critical race theorists who would be deeply critical of DEI. That DEI is it emerged, the discourse around diversity, equity, and inclusion emerged because people were more averse to stronger forms of affirmative action. And so they saw DEI as actually a watered down version of earlier programs. And so some people thought that DEI was just too weak. It wasn't strong enough to remedy past and continuing discrimination. But those distinctions don't matter if all we're doing is appealing to slogans. If all we're doing is appealing to hatred, if we're trying to probe feelings of guilt, these things don't matter. These important distinctions don't matter between critical race theory and even DEI.
And to your point about race still matters because structural racism still exists, just want to define for listeners like structural racism as a community lawyer, which is someone who uses their legal skills and knowledge to educate communities so that they can collectively, build political power and just build systems locally that benefit them. Structural racism basically is when laws and policies and systems work together to create and maintain racial inequality in this country, even if no one's being openly racist, right? So to hear Chief Justice Roberts say that, he's basically saying structural racism doesn't exist. Unless someone blatantly says, you can't come in here N-word to vote, then basically, there's no structures or systems in place that's diluting the Black voting power, right? That's basically what he's saying. You have to be intentionally racist. And we know that there's no one standing at the door blatantly telling us you can't vote because you're Black. If you know anyone that has said that, let me know. I want to have you on the show. But I'm just saying, no. And I say that because I did have a paralegal at my previous firm tell me that someone told her, I'd be glad when Trump is elected because you won't be able to eat here anymore. So there are some people out there that have lost their minds and they really want to take us back. And they really believe that Make America Great Again means taking us back. And a lot of us feel as if we are being taken back, guys. But that is what structural racism is. It's not just about like these bad people telling us, we can't come here to eat or we can't vote. It's about how the systems are built, and systems are invisible. So it's really hard to articulate someone's bias, right? Like you go for a job, they see your name, they see my name on the resume, Yolanda, that might be a Black woman, and those biases are real. And they could say, and if they're not checked, or if you don't even care about them being checked, then I won't get a call for a job just because I'm being discriminated against just based on my name, and they're assuming who I am, and with that assumption about what my race is comes other stereotypes and assumptions. So these systems are built, and what are those systems? Those systems are housing, education, lending practices, the criminal justice system, and healthcare access. All of those things can work together, like Professor Lovelace says, especially like the maternal health and Black women, the healthcare system can work in a way that consistently disadvantages Black people, Black communities over time. But unfortunately, it's 2026 and folks are telling us we should turn the page on civil rights. So we talked about the history and how important the Reconstruction era was, Professor Lovelace. So I feel it serves as a warning, right? So what type of warning because there was backlash to Reconstruction. So can we talk about the warning and the backlash?
Yeah, so Reconstruction on the federal level occurs roughly from 1865 to 1877. There was in 1876 a contested election, and the Republican Party, which at that time was a champion of the Reconstruction agenda, decided to give up on Reconstruction in exchange for winning this contested presidential election. So the Democrats gave up the presidency. The Republicans then gave up, as part of the compromise of 1877, they gave up Reconstruction. And so when Reconstruction ends, federal troops are pulled out of the South, right? A lot of the programs from Reconstruction are over. And what we see in the decades that follow is redemption and then later Jim Crow laws. So there's racial progress during Reconstruction, and then there's racist backlash to this racial progress. And that takes us to the late 19th century. And states by the late 19th century are changing their constitutions. So they're creating constitutions that have poll taxes, that have grandfather clauses, that create criminal laws that are being designed to target African Americans. The idea was that Black people were more criminal, more likely to steal. And so let's create laws that are felonies that are tied to voting. And so if someone becomes if someone becomes a felon, then we can disenfranchise that person. We can criminalize their activity in profound ways by making some crimes felonies and not misdemeanors. And then if that's tied to the voting rolls, then we can disenfranchise people in multiple ways. So we see this by the late 19th century. So racial progress and then racist backlash. If we fast forward, we see similar kinds of patterns throughout our history. Go back to 1954, Brown versus Board of Education, right? The U.S. Supreme Court declared that public schools, pursuant to the 14th Amendment and the Equal Protection Clause, had to be desegregated, right? After Brown versus Board of Education, what do we see? Massive resistance. States, in particular throughout the South, rising up and even closing some schools to prevent desegregation. And certainly desegregation, when it happened, was very slow and often very violent. African-American school children were attacked. Your mind should go back to the Little Rock Nine and all of the things that they faced. But they were just one group of people. As school desegregation went on, there was incredible backlash there. But racial progress with Brown versus Board of Education and then racist backlash. Fast forward to the 21st century. Barack Obama was elected to be the first African-American president. Regardless of how people may feel about Obama one way or another, his election symbolized for some people that we had entered a new era. Now, some people went too far. They said that we are in a post-racial society. No doubt we were not in a post-racial society. But again, the symbolism of Obama, right, was a marker for many people of racial progress. But what happens after Barack Obama is elected? We see the rise of the Tea Party. We see the rise of these groups that were just from the beginning using very white nationalist frameworks to challenge this Black presidency. And then you see the rise of Donald Trump. That Trump has to be explained, at least in part, as backlash to Obama.
Yeah, you're right.
Yeah, so there's this theme of progress. When you see progress, you often see racist backlash as well.
Backlash. And so there's nothing new under the sun, guys. Nothing new under the sun. I've said this before in the show that the day after President Obama was elected, I didn't think we were in a post-racial society, but I thought, wow, there's hope. There was enough of them, enough white people, enough of us, enough of everyone that voted him into office that maybe there was progress. But on my way to Eastern North Carolina, from Raleigh, I was headed to Wilson, my hometown. A pickup truck passed me, and on the back was a big sign, and the acronym of his name, Obama, was spelled as an acronym, One Big Ass Mistake, America. That was the day after he was elected. A pickup truck on the way to Wilson, North Carolina. And of course, it just like deflated my balloon. Took away a little bit of my Black joy, but I realized then it's about to get ugly. Then we saw the Tea Party. I remember one day being at home. I'm like, why was I at home? Because I'm always working. Maybe I was pregnant. I don't know. But I was at home, and I remember looking on the news, and there was another senator that used to be really loud. Now they all are, right, MAGAs. But they were on bullhorns telling Obama to come out the White House. Like, there were people protesters, come out the White House, you Muslim. It was just saying that he was not American, the racism around that, his name and what it meant, and if he was un-American, the birthers, those were the birthers speeches. So we saw the birther movement. I mean, we've seen all this like backlash, and to your point, just to connect it all, Reconstruction was a moment in this country where Black people weren't just voting, y'all. We were governing. So many Black people rose to political power in state legislators, or to state legislatures, Congress, all of that. But like you said, it was also the rise of the KKK, intimidation, lynching, voter suppression. Southern states passed black codes, which, as you mentioned, later evolved into Jim Crow laws. So, I mean, it was a clear signal that this progress that we had made, that there was this white resistance, I should say white racist resistance to it. So the moment Black people gained power, y'all, the system moved to take it back. And so, I mean, we can say the same thing here. Like in 2026, we're still seeing a pattern of Black progress, white racist backlash, and civil rights being rolled back. And I like to say that they're not playing checkers, they're playing chess. I mean, the Republicans, but really, they're not really playing chess. They're just like dusting off the blueprint that their ancestors used, and they're rolling back our rights, right? Because we should be having voter right battles in 2026, where our ancestors already bled. Some were killed, some died, they marched for it. Why are we still having voter right battles?
Yeah, I think in the sort of master narrative around how many people think about racial progress over time, many people think that to be sure, race relations may not be what we want them to be now, but they're better than what they used to be. So our parents had a worse racial struggle. Our grandparents certainly had worse racial conditions. But our children are going to have better conditions than us. When we begin to interrogate that kind of simple narrative around racial progress over time, we have to understand that that narrative is deeply flawed. Let's think about this in terms of mass incarceration. There are more African American people who are incarcerated now than at the time of Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, right? Today, there are fewer doctrinal tools, legal tools to redress voter discrimination in 2026 than there were in 1982 or 83, right? When the Voting Rights Act was amended. Affirmative action programs that would have been easily constitutional in the 1960s or 70s, 80s, 90s, early 2000s are now deemed to be unlawful. And so the kind of simple narratives that things are just going to necessarily get better over time are not true. I mean, even think about in the last 6 years, after George Floyd was murdered, there are millions of people out in the streets who are demanding justice. You have people who, for the very first time, are picking up books and reading about terms like anti-racism. Most people hadn't heard of the term anti-racism before that moment, right? You have corporations that are saying, we are going to have more diversity trainings, we're going to hire more people of color, et cetera, et cetera. 6 years after that moment, 5 years after that moment, where are they now, right? They've gotten rid of all of those initiatives. Again, progress is not promised.
Progress is not promised. And Coretta Scott King is quoted as saying that every generation has to fight. maybe paraphrasing that a lot, but we're seeing every generation has to fight. That's why it's important, listeners, that our history is not even told like the way we're talking about today. That's not told in even today. Even today, I have kids, and you guys may too, who are listening. I have kids, in school age kids, and they're not learning the depth of what we're talking about now, Reconstruction and what it meant, and the advances we have made. And how there was this backlash. They're not hearing that because, again, you have the Moms for Liberty people will be like, you're making us feel guilty, or some kind of way to attack the teaching of the truth and the facts. And we know that this administration as well passed an executive order that actually attacked history. The Black Museum of History and Culture in D.C., and the Smithsonian and these other, which falls underneath the Smithsonian Institute, that we talk too much about slavery, was a quote from Trump, that we are talking too much about slavery. And I think the executive order, I don't know if you remember, Professor Lovelace, something about restoring, it was some weird thing. I think I blocked it out, but the order was called Restoring, I don't know, Truth or something like that to our museums. I'm gonna have to look it up and come back to that. But yeah, so there's this like concerted effort, y'all, to erase history. We saw where even some monuments, and I think there were nameplates. I forgot. I don't know if it was in Pennsylvania where they were trying to remove, history markers. That was based on like our history. They were trying to do that. I think there was a fight to get that replaced, but these things are happening. And what I want to say too is that some of the key points that you're saying is that, we may have rights on paper, but rights in practice is something different. And political power changes everything. So I'm always going to connect this back to voting, y'all, because King, in one of his speech, he said, we're going to go to DC and we're going to take their power. We have to take the power, and we do that through putting people in place who are proven and who seem genuinely concerned about the issues that impact our communities. That's what Trump supporters did, So there's also this fear, I feel, amongst some MAGA voters. I know some MAGA voters. Do you know any personally?
Sure.
Okay. And they don't seem outwardly racist. Like when I interact with them, they don't seem outwardly racist. I know my next door neighbor. I know he's a Trump supporter because he had a whole banner on his porch that had Trump, like doing his first term. He didn't do it this time, maybe because we stopped talking to him, started giving him the side eye for that. But I know he supports Trump, but I haven't declared him to be someone that has racist intent or that's racist, because he's been nothing but kind and pleasant to me and my husband. But I'm also concerned because I'm just like, but for you to vote that way, you don't care about me. You don't care about my survival. You don't care about, my right to, liberty and the pursuit of happiness, or my children's right to liberty and pursuit of happiness in this country, for you to vote that way. And I don't know, do you think the backlash, like just for ordinary folks, not for the political folks, not for the puppet masters, or the legislators who want to just be greedy and maintain power, do we think that ordinary people who supported Trump, like, what is this fear that they have? Are they fearing that we're taking something that they have? Are they not going to have what they currently have or what they think they have? And most of these are like low wealth white people, right? What's the fear?
Yeah, I mean, everyone who voted for Donald Trump, certainly there will be many people who would say, I am not intentionally racist. And they, in their minds, may not feel as if they are being intentionally racist. And I think that that's fair. But you don't have to intend for harm. You don't have to intend harm for choices to produce harmful outcomes. I think that's the thing. Intent is not the only thing that matters. Impact matters as well. And so someone can use their words and reject explicitly racism and then support systems that produce unequal racial results. And so I think that that has to be part of our discourse. I think that part of the discourse also has to be about, that having educational opportunities where folks can have serious conversations about the level of the rhetoric being used. Again, just deconstructing the president's own words, right, reveals no doubt racist intent, but someone does not have to say, I voted for Donald Trump and I'm racist to support an agenda that has real world consequences, right? So good intentions are not going to cancel out these harmful consequences. It's what the choices enable people to do. And so I think that that is just a big part of the discourse that's sort of missed out on. The other part is that there are many people who vote against their own economic interest all the time, right? The Affordable Care Act was a lot of things. Wildly imperfect was one of those things. And at the same time, it expanded healthcare for millions of Americans. There were many people who were in need of healthcare, who opposed the Care Act because they opposed Barack Obama. They were willing to privilege racism in certain circumstances over, right, an economic outcome that would have actually benefited them, right? Du Bois talks about this. W.B. Du Bois talks about this, and many other scholars have picked up on Du Bois, and they talked about the wages of whiteness, right? Why will some poor white Americans not be in solidarity with people of color to fight against class-based oppression, right? It's because there's some sort of psychological wage, at least for some, right, that they get from, at least I'm not Black, at least I'm not a person of color. And so we see that throughout history. So the phenomenon that you're talking about has deep historical roots.
Yeah. Yeah. So for all of you who, call yourselves my friend and Professor Lovelace's friend, if you voted for Trump, I mean, you really get to realize that, even if you didn't intentionally mean to cause others harms, especially those, who come from a ancestry where there's been, historic racism and suppression or oppression in this country, then, you have voted for outcomes. Because like you said, this particular president's, his own rhetoric has stated things like, shithole countries. When you talk about predominantly Black and brown countries, you got in and you attack, certain refugees from certain countries. They were all Black and brown. Then you brought on like some white Afrikaners and said that they were experiencing genocide, in their country, ignoring the whole history of how they got the land to begin with, right? Which was violence against the original inhabitants who were Black or South African. So, I mean, I hate that, I have to raise children and still talk about this. But I think it's still important. And everyone's not racist, everyone's not. And so that's the good thing. And there are some people I feel like, hopefully, if they're educated, they could, maybe we can come to a meeting of the minds around this. But who knows? We're still in this together. And so as you also talked about, which was this originalism theory, like judges like Clarence Thomas believe in, going back to the original meaning of what it meant when it was written. I try to always look at both sides. I mean, I can understand that you want to understand. I mean, because even when, we were talking about policy, locally, like, a bill, we want to see what was the congressional intent when they wrote the bill. Sometimes that does help you interpret it. But I can't believe, like someone like Clarence Thomas, who has benefited from civil rights, will say some of the things that he has said, publicly and also support and written and led some of the opinions he has. Any thoughts regarding that?
Oh, we could have a whole session on this. A little bit about Clarence Thomas. Obviously, he grew up in the Jim Crow South, coming from Georgia, in a segregated society. He later attends college, and by many accounts, he was very much actually interested in Black student politics. He was influenced by sort of the Black nationalist currents of the day. But then he goes through a sort of existential crisis, a sort of personal crisis where he begins to question his own racial politics. At the same time, he also goes through a law school experience where he felt that liberals in law school looked down upon him. Now, a little bit about Clarence Thomas in law school. Clarence Thomas was admitted to law school shortly after Dr. King was assassinated. Yale University, where he attended law school, began to use affirmative action shortly after Dr. King was assassinated. Admissions officials at Yale understood that there had not been enough opportunities for people of color to attend elite law schools. And so Clarence Thomas was very likely admitted under an admissions policy that considered his race. So he got access to this very elite Yale legal education through affirmative action. When Thomas, if we look at Thomas's early jobs, they were civil rights jobs. So he had a civil rights job in the Department of Education. He later chaired the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the EEOC, another race job. He went on to the Federal Court of Appeals, and then he was put up for confirmation at the U.S. Supreme Court level to take whose seat? Thurgood Marshall's seat, right? What many people at that time called the black seat on the Supreme Court. And so Clarence Thomas is benefiting at every turn from, right, race conscious opportunities. Thomas was deemed not to be highly qualified, only qualified by the American Bar Association during his confirmation hearings. Many Thomas supporters said, oh, he's being rendered as not highly qualified because of his race. He played the race card there. When Anita Hill accused Clarence Thomas of sexual harassment, he said that he was the victim of a high-tech lynching, again, invoking these race and gender-based tropes to fight these allegations of Anita Hill, very credible allegations of Anita Hill. And so Thomas has continued throughout his career to benefit from racial considerations. And at the same time, he wants to close the door behind him for others to follow.
And why is that? Is it tokenism? I want to be the only one. I mean, you know how to say crabs in the crab bucket, just to, break it down, and just regular talk to listeners. Like, why is it? Why would you want to benefit from racial considerations and not act like it doesn't exist? Maybe is it an internal hate? I mean, like, what is it? I don't know. I mean, like you said, that's a whole separate show.
I mean, lots of scholars have said,
racism,
Absolutely. Lots of scholars have raised any number of those points. Does he have internalized racism? Is he invested in tokenism? Does he want to be the only Black person in certain spaces? People have to come to their own conclusions, but no doubt, regardless of his intent, so to go back to what we talked about, right? We know the outcome and the impact. And the impact has been to close the doors for so many people that could benefit from the same types of programs and laws and policies that he's benefited from.
And I want to say, yeah, even in addition to, the Voter Rights Act and Section 2 being dismantled, because we supposedly live in a colorblind society, and now you basically have to prove racist intent in order to challenge these maps. Like you said, a majority Black, area, only one Black majority voting district. I mean, what sense does that make? And I've had some local leaders who have been involved in local redistricting efforts and like in Rocky Mount. They've had success because they've already, dismantled like the discriminatory wars. Like they had at-large war systems in their city, and which was not allowing, true representation or allowing people to actually choose the candidates of their choice. So we've been on calls with the map drawers or demographers, and we've chosen the lines and how the district should be. Awesome episode. I did 2 weeks ago with Sue Perico, Angela Bryant, and Gloria Davis. So, we're in the group chat this morning, and these are women, who are my elders. I respect. They're like mentors to me. But I'm texting them like, where do we go from here? Sounds like Martin Luther King's book. Where do we go from here? Chaos our community. Like, what do we do now? What's the path forward? Could we still have local wins and gains on the very local level, like school boards and city council or town commissioner elections, but nationally and statewide, with the gerrymandering? And North Carolina has led these efforts. It just seems a little like hope is depleted. Anything for the listeners? What are your thoughts about where do we go from here?
Yeah, I think a lot about Dr. King here. Where do we go from here? And hope, and being prisoners to hope. I think that a couple of things have to change within our communities if we are to move forward. Organize, organize, organize. I think that we need to, within our communities, we need to sort of rehabilitate older civil rights organizations and even create new civil rights organizations where people are meeting regularly across time and space, right? Where this might be a mass membership organization. You might pay a couple dollars and be a dues paying member, right? This might also mean, though, just having meetings and Zoom meetings, but also in-person meetings where people are getting together over time, right? So we can march on Washington. We can march on the state capitol, but what do you do between marches? What in terms of structure, what do our churches look like? What kind of theologies are being preached there, right? Is there social justice ministry at your church, right? The kinds of civic life that we had during the civil rights movement, right? We don't have that same kind of civic life today, right? Many people go to work and come home, and I know that life is challenging. We have kids to raise, right? We have lots of other things, but being a part and an active part of civic life where people are learning about the issues, where they're able to articulate the issues and then go to their neighbors and talk about those issues, right? And so we don't have to wait until it's time to register voters, right? We can have these conversations months and even years in advance, right? And prepare there. So I think that one of the big things is to organize, organize, organize. We need people whose full-time jobs, in the spirit of Ella Baker, one of the founders of SNCC, right? Where there are people who are full-time, more people who are full-time organizers. That is their job. We need many more people who have those types of opportunities. So this means that we need to open up our pocketbooks and hire more people who are doing that kind of day-to-day work. I think that that's one of the big things. I think some of the other issues are turnout, right? So voter turnout, right? When I look at the percentages of turnout, right, we could turn out a lot more people. And some of these elections are so close, both locally and then nationwide. When I think about the Chief Justice of the North Carolina Supreme Court race, right? Just
Earls, yeah. No, you're talking about the Chief Justice.
Beasley.
Okay, sorry.
Just a couple of years ago, right? Just a couple hundred votes decided that election, right? We need, and that's a statewide election, right? That's not even local, right? We need to turn out the people who are already on our rolls, right? Because in a state like North Carolina, where many races, statewide races, are so competitive, right? We can, at least at the state level, right, change the direction of our state. And so organize, turn out people, and then dedicate ourselves to having spaces where people are being educated over time and space. So these sort of radical counter public spaces. So we need things like more freedom schools. We need Saturday schools. We need places where people are coming together to develop a vocabulary around social justice, and that we're training people, and that you have teachers and you have disciples and folks who are going out and reaching their neighbors. And so those are some of my thoughts about where do we go from here.
Yeah, definitely. And I just, I'm still on a high from the North Carolina Black Summit, which is its 20th year this year. But the North Carolina Black Alliance is a nonprofit 501c3 organization that does some of what you're saying. But yeah, so I mean, they need support, donations. We need to build coalitions. In our community, and we can't act like we forgot. Like, we got the spirit, like you said, Ella Baker, you have all these folks in us. We have the spirit in us. We know we got to do. Sometimes I've had closed door conversations with folks, and is it a classism thing? Do middle class Blacks think that they've arrived, because they're taking trips, or doing whatever they're able to do, or they're driving a car that they want to drive, or they have the material things, that they want to have. But it's more than just having material things. And so I do see this, the civil rights, regardless of what class you were. If you were able to have some class, you all were told you couldn't eat at that restaurant, you couldn't sleep at that hotel, you couldn't do this. I feel like we were all in it together. And we look back at history, there was some division, there were some debates, there were some discussions around the best course. There were some people who didn't feel like Martin Luther King shouldn't even be the face of the leader, but he rose to that because of the people embraced him. But so if you're middle class Black and you're listening to this and you feel like your life is okay, and it might be, but your life probably could be better if it wasn't for the barriers over your head. You probably could be richer, probably could be healthier, you probably could be more established. If you look at your counterparts, I know we all have looked at counterparts that, we've all got the same law degree, we've all, worked at the same jobs, but maybe they may be a little more advanced. Maybe they're trust fund babies. I have a colleague, I love her a lot, but she has wealthy parents that support her, what I'm saying? And then where did that wealth come from? And I want to talk about housing before we end, because I am a fair housing advocate. So we talk about, civil rights being dismantled. Like I've said time and time again, after King and others marched, for Voter Rights Act, King, moved to Chicago and found himself and his family living in the slums of Chicago. And he realized that open housing, which was what it was called back then, was the thing that was needed to fully assimilate, right? Because it was about assimilation then, which people have said has been the worst thing that's happened to us, assimilation, right? Because then we gave up our entrepreneurships, we gave up our, our own like Black dollars that were in our community, and then we began, shopping, at other people's stores and shops and all of that. And some people have said there needs to be a movement back to Black Wall Street, but history has shown that they burned it down. Do you think that Lovelace?
I mean, again, that is a big question. I mean, housing equity is so important. Housing shapes so much of our lives. Housing affects what public school your child can attend, right? It determines often safety, right? What neighborhood you live in. Certainly, housing is the primary way that most Americans build their wealth. Right. Home equity is the largest source of wealth for most families. And you talked about generational impact, right? We see wealth inequality for lots of reasons. Part of it is about access to housing, right? Going back even to the creation of the suburbs, that the federal government helped to subsidize creation of the suburbs and these single family homes. And we did not have access to the loans to get to the suburbs, right? And so this is some of the things that King and others were fighting about. And so I think that the issue of housing is, again, understanding the past, right? So past discrimination continues to shape the present, right? That the discriminatory lending practices by the federal government and by banks with redlining, right, continues to compound today. And so we need to, address voting rights. We need to address access to education. but housing also has to be on the radar. This one of the big themes that's come from our conversation today is about how race touches every area of
Yes.
American life, right? And that um, many of the rights that we fight for on one front are tied to other rights. So housing is tied to educational equality, for
Yeah.
example, and that these rights are interdependent.
Yeah, you're so right, and I love to say that housing sits at the heart of multiple systems that reproduce inequity. Because, like we say, schools, whether or not you have access to doctors, whether or not you have access to healthy grocery stores, or is it just Dollar Generals or Family Dollars in your neighborhood? Eating at the Family Dollar is not healthy. Now, how far is a grocery store, even like a Food Lion? From where you live, do you have transportation? All those things. But we have seen these attacks, like they didn't repeal the Fair Housing Act outright, like they haven't repealed the Voter Rights Act outright. But what they're doing is dramatically weakening it, right? Or redefining it. What we've seen as it relates to the Fair Housing Act is, there have been some shifting priorities at HUD. Like we've seen with the U.S. Department of Education, the woman who's the secretary, I don't remember unimportant people's names. I can't think of her name right now. All I know is that her job is to dismantle the U.S., work herself out of a job. I think that was her instructions from Trump. Put yourself out of work. That hasn't happened yet, but people are still concerned about it. But, one of the rules, the big battleground under the Fair Housing Act, is that once it was created, again, you needed some kind of enforcement tool, because the language just like affirmatively further for housing, but people wanting to know, what does that mean? Like local jurisdictions wanting to know, what does it mean to affirmatively further for housing? So under the Obama era, he actually defined that. He created a strong affirmatively further for housing rule that was data driven. It required planning to address segregated communities, right? The Trump era 1.0, and even now, started scaring the suburban white women. You're going to have these people come to your community, live in your community. There needs to be local control, not federal mandates over who can live in your community. So he reduced federal oversight, right? And so the Biden era came back, and then, he tried to restore and strengthen the Family Further for Housing Act, but he never got a final rule on it. So that proposed rule was just left standing there for whatever reason. I don't know. But that's my criticism of his era. But he did emphasize equity, desegregation, accountability. Neither era addressed what we are facing now, which is not that, we have segregated communities. Some people prefer segregated communities, like Southeast Raleigh. A lot of those residents told me, we love to live around our people. We love to live where we have mutual aid. We love to live where we have culture, where we have roots. But the Fair Housing Act, neither of the rules have addressed gentrification. Like, I don't think King ever imagined that one day, white flight will be reversed. They will want to come back into those communities that were considered to be, quote unquote, the slum, quote unquote, the ghetto, which is the language that they used back in the 60s. But that has happened. But my point is, the reason why it was always a concern was because communities excluded Black families. Now we can see in gentrified communities that Black families are being excluded again because of the race wealth gap in America that you mentioned. Can you afford to live in an area that has been injected with wealth? There's a lot of displacement. A lot of people have been displaced, and when you look at it, the New York Times did an article. Basically said that there's, two different neighborhoods basically in downtown Raleigh, one Black, one white, because that's the reality of what we live in. So it's coming full circles that we can't stop talking about race because systemic racism still exists. Maybe this original sin will always be with us. So that's why we have to ensure that, we too can sing America like Langston Hughes, right? We too can benefit from what the ideal of America is. Because if we're going to live here, we might as well make it better. We might as well make it inclusive. I know some people I don't care about America, but they still live here. And we're going to live here, then, we got to continue to fight. But I want to give you I want you to have the last words before I close, Professor Lovelace. And I want to thank you again for being on the show and for bringing history. I was taking notes because you said some things. I was like, oh, he's preaching here. I need to remember that and go back and read myself. I brushed up, I should say, on some things.
No, this has been a wonderful conversation. Organize, organize, organize. I think that if we wait until October or November to move forward, we've moved too late. And in fact, it's happening right now. Gerrymandering has happened in this state, and many other states are trying to gerrymander their legislative districts. There's a race to the bottom. And that's just a symptom of something else that's going on. And so organize, organize, organize. Have people at meetings in person, have people who are invested deeply into organizational life. This will help to create the structures needed to change both society and law. Thank you. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. And thank you, listeners, for spending your morning with us on All Rights Reserved. Thank you again, Professor Timothy Lovelace. I appreciate having your expertise here this morning. Listeners, we covered a lot today, but if you take nothing else with you, take this. Civil rights has never been a straight line. It has always been a cycle, progress, backlash, and the fight to hold the line. We have to hold the line. We have to hold the line, right? And that's what this conversation is about. When we talk about structural racism, we're talking about systems that didn't disappear. They just adapted. When we talk about originalism, what Justice Clarence Thomas and others who are in the majority of the court say is their theory around the Constitution and laws, we're asking really whose history gets to define our future. When we talk about, we didn't talk about it, but we should. Maybe you can come back again and talk about the filibuster and Trump's attempt to get rid of the filibuster. That's really a power move, right? That's a move to block, something important that we need. And when we talk about housing, we're talking about the foundation of everything, where you live, how you live, whether you ever get the chance to get ahead. Again, like I say here all the time, policy is not abstract. Policy is personal. We got to take this up personal because it's showing up in our rent, it's showing up in our child's school, it's showing up in our commute to work, it's showing up in our stress, our health, and our wealth. So the question is, are we paying attention when they're being reshaped right in front of us, when civil rights is being dismantled right in front of us? Stay informed. As Professor Lovelace said, find a way to organize, get connected with groups that are doing it. I know some folks who are at the General Assembly every week. I know some folks who are in the trenches of movement. So feel free to connect with me if you need a place to organize. You can start organizing in your own community. What's a concern that you have? Connect that with your neighbor's concern, and you can move collectively to get it done. But because the fight for rights have not ended, we have to realize it's just changing form, and we got to hold the line. But this is All Rights Reserved, and your rights still matter. Thank you. Don't go anywhere. Stay plugged right here to 92.1 FM, the People's Choice Station. Until next time.
All Rights Reserved with Yolanda Taylor on Choice.